Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Museum. If you can find a seat, we're going to get started. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the manager of public programs here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Dialogue and Discourse in the Public Sphere, Art and Activism, featuring Zoe Strauss, Alexandra Bell, and moderated by Ruba Katrib. Tonight's event is held in conjunction with the exhibition Martha Rosler, Irrespective, on view in our first floor galleries through March 3rd. So if you didn't have a chance to see it tonight, please come back and do so. We have a few related programs still coming up in the next few weeks, including a two-part screen printing workshop next Thursday, February 21st and 28th from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. And on the closing day of the exhibition, we're hosting our second annual Wikipedia Editathon, co-presented with Art and Feminism, which will include a gallery talk with Leon Levy Assistant Curator Shira Backer, and catalog and type designers Miko McGinty and Rebecca Silvers. And for updates on everything else we have coming up this season, you can visit our website to sign up for our e-news. Now I would like to introduce this evening's moderator, and note that unfortunately Eric Gottesman, who was scheduled to be part of tonight's event, was unable to attend. Ruba Katrib is curator at MoMA PS1, and from 2012 to 2018, she was curator at Sculpture Center in New York. At Sculpture Center, she organized numerous group exhibitions, including 74 million tons, The Eccentrics, Puddle, Portal, Pothole, and Better Homes, as well as solo shows with artists including Carissa Rodriguez, Kelly Akashi, Sam Anderson, and Aki Sasimoto. Previously, she was the associate curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, North Miami, from 2007 to 2012. Katrib was also the co-founder of the residency and exhibition space Three Walls in Chicago, and has held positions at the Renaissance Society and the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, where she currently serves on the graduate committee. She was a research advisor for the 2018 Carnegie International, and a member of the advisory board for Recess, a nonprofit artist residency and exhibition space in New York. She regularly contributes texts to museum catalogs and periodicals, including Art in America, Art Forum, Kaleidoscope, and Moose. Now, if everyone can take a moment to just please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Ruba Katrib, Alexandra Bell, and Zoe Strauss.
Thank you, Jenna. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and happy Valentine's Day. I'm thrilled to be here this evening to moderate this conversation on the occasion of Martha Rosler's survey exhibition here at the Jewish Museum. Today we will engage in a discussion with two artists, Alexandra Bell and Zoe Strauss, who we can also consider in line with Rosler's legacy. On reflection of Rosler's early work, which is also some of her best-known work, she has examined the politics of domesticity, forging new connections between sexism, war, and imperialism. She has used the language of advertising and media to create jarring juxtapositions of images and content. In pictures of ideal and stereotyped homes and the representation of women within them, Rosler would insert images of the Vietnam War in her series House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home. I think this line between interior and exterior spaces will be central to our conversation today. Rosler's work has primarily been viewed in museums and galleries. Her works have circulated as reproductions, but have focused on bringing the concerns and stark realities of the world into the spaces of art. She has continued to document the changing facets of political life and civic space. For instance, since 2015, she has photographed the changing and gentrifying neighborhood of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, where she lives, which is also part of a larger engagement. These ongoing projects function by accumulating an archive that can document transformations which can be examined over time. For the sake of our discussion today, we will look at how artists' methods have used similar tactics of graphic imagery, collage, durational series, and other interventions to move inside of the exhibition space as well as outside onto the street. In this sense, we can gain a sense of how strategies of activism shift within these various contexts. So with that said, Alexandra Bell and Zoe Strauss will each give a brief presentation on their work, and then we'll speak together for a bit, and then we'll open for questions from the audience. So allow me to introduce both artists now. Zoe Strauss is an installation artist and photographer living and working in Philadelphia. In 2006, her work was included in the Whitney Biennial, and her solo exhibition Ramp Project, Zoe Strauss, was shown at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia. In 2012, a mid-career retrospective, Zoe Strauss 10 Years, was shown at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, accompanied by a display of 54 billboards showing her photographs, and at the International Center of Photography in New York. In 2013, Strauss was part of the Carnegie International, focusing her lens on Homestead, Pennsylvania. Strauss has received numerous awards for her photography, including a Seedling Award from the Leeway Foundation, a Pew Fellowship, the George Gund Foundation Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2017. She is a member of the prestigious Magnum Photos Cooperative. Strauss also serves as an executive director of the Philadelphia Public Art Project. Alexandra Bell is a multidisciplinary artist who investigates the complexities of narrative information consumption and perception. Utilizing various media, she deconstructs language and imagery to explore the tensions between marginal experiences and dominant histories. Through investigative research, she considers the way that media frameworks construct memory and inform discursive practices around race, politics, and culture. Her work has been exhibited at MoMA PS1, We Buy Gold, Koenig and Clinton Gallery, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Atlanta Contemporary, Pomona College Museum of Art, Spencer Museum of Art, and Ustan Gallery at Bennington College. She is the recipient of the 2018 Center of Photography Infinity Award and in the Applied category. She's also a 2018 Soros Equality Fellow and a 2018-19 Bard at Brooklyn Public Library Fellow. Bell holds a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities from the University of Chicago and an MS in Journalism from Columbia University. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank you. So I'm going to open with just a brief overview of my work, my public art series, just to kind of give you a sense of what the work is. I don't want to assume that you know it, and then I'm sure we'll flesh that out in our conversation.
Go ahead.
Is it?
But apologies, I did not move through
Okay.
these install images, so we can just look quickly at the show downstairs. Some views. Okay, now it's you.
Now it's me? Okay, now it's my turn. All right. My one and only at the moment public art series is called Counter Narratives. What I do in this series is, can you hear me now? Is that better? What I do in this series is edit and kind of reimagine New York Times articles, and I'm really looking for latent racial bias and some inequality that you can kind of suss out in the media. And so when I first thought of this project, although it was really kind of in its infancy, I was a student at Columbia University. And part of the assignment that we had to do as an intro to journalism was we had to read 3 newspapers a day. So at work, we looked at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Daily News. And the purpose of this assignment was to get a sense of how publications covered the same news. And during that time, I started to think that something was off, right? All of this information is factual, but sometimes it just didn't feel true. So I was curious if there was a way that sometimes the news media has a framework that belies something else. And so when 2016 rolled around, and I think we've just experienced kind of another rash of police shootings of unarmed Black individuals, I really started to look at the way some of those stories were put forth and started quite simply editing and kind of annotating and just kind of writing my views down, some of those pieces. And so I phoned my mom around that time and I said, hey, I have this idea. I think I want to be an artist. She found funny. She says, you already went to school for humanities, so you just want to be broke your whole life. Anyway, I had an article in mind. There was a 2014 New York Times article about Michael Brown, who had been killed by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson. I believe he was shot 6 times, and his body was left in the street for 4.5 hours. There was an infamous kind of No Angel article written by the Times at that time. And so if you're looking at the screen now, can everyone see that okay? I feel like from my angle it's not so easy. The bottom part of the paper, Two Lives at a Crossroads in Ferguson, there are 2 side-by-side articles. One of them is about Officer Darren Wilson, that one's on the left, and the one on the right is about Michael Brown. And so my major issue with the construction of this article was that it presents this kind of idea that these individuals have equal responsibility in the situation and that they're peers, right? And so I really wanted to kind of point out that one person was an officer with infinitely kind of more power and one person was a kid. So I started to kind of rework the language, and what you're seeing now is kind of my early kind of markings that I was sharing on social media before this kind of went to the streets. And so this is just me reworking the title, Crossroads in Ferguson, a profile officer, that was the title that I gave on the side for Darren Wilson, and a teenager with promise on the other side. Ultimately, I came to this kind of iteration, which is the one that I would later share in public. It really just kind of bare bones. This officer, white officer, Darren Wilson, killed this young Black teenager, Michael Brown. And so I just kind of stripped it down to its bare bones, and I changed it to this. This is a second panel. And so I'm going to share 3 more works with you guys, but just a quick sense of how counter-narratives work. The first panel, the one that you will see on the left, will be the article as it was originally presented in the New York Times. That will be marked up with kind of the same way you would edit someone's work. Would include my comments about things as well as instructions as to how to move forward. And the second panel is the redo. This probably isn't the best example of that, but I later shared it in public. This went out at 2 a.m. illegally and put it up in the streets. This is somewhere in Bed-Stuy. This one stayed up for a little while and then it got covered up. The public was kind of pissed about that, and so they uncovered it. At this moment, I started to get a sense of how people were reacting to the work and realized that a lot of people were very attached to it. Some people saw it as a project. In other spaces, sometimes the first panel, the one with the redactions, was missing, and people just thought it was a family that was really proud of their kid graduating. And others people knew, but they couldn't figure out who the person was because I didn't name Michael Brown. At some point, this wall, which you can see is quite covered with graffiti, was painted, but they wouldn't paint over it. So I had a sense then of the impact. And I decided that around that time that I really wanted to kind of create a space for people to engage with the news as a group. And my thinking was these are each about 2 by 3 feet each. So quite small, a couple of people can look at them. So the sense was to blow them up. These are 6 feet by 8 feet each. This is at MoMA PS1. You've seen this one. I added a page with my annotation, so it has highlights and red ink. And so this is at MoMA PS1. This is at University of Kansas. This is on their library there. That's the first work. Quickly, the second work, if you look at the bottom half of the work, and I'm just sharing this so you can get a sense of where the work was located. This is what was there. Accused of fabricating robbery, swimmers feel tension in Brazil. And then you see a photo of not a swimmer. Again, with markings, word choice, change title. There's instructions there that I provide. Redo caption, replace picture with swimmers. It's the ultimate redo there. I use race as an identifier in a number of these because I think whiteness often goes unseen. And the assumption also is that whites are Americans, and so I wanted to make that distinction here. And it's also me thinking back to a time, I think in the 40s, where the Times used to name the race of the perpetrator in headlines. So that's the second work. That's called Olympic Threat. This one's 7.5 feet. Each panel is 7.5 feet. This is, the bigger work is missing from there, sorry. So those are the two panels. That's the kind of the before and after. This is work 3. A Tulsa man accused of harassing Lebanese family is charged with murder. This is kind of my layout. I don't copy the paper by photocopying it. I redo it in InDesign. So this is me. This is, my issues with this is that I felt like it othered the victim. He was Lebanese. I wasn't trying to strip him of his identity, but I think the actual hate crime in some ways, the guy who committed the crime, Vernon Majors, had lived in the neighborhood in Tulsa for maybe 7 years. The victim lived there for 34. And so I was very confused by the paper's decision to name the white guy Tulsa man versus the guy who'd been there for 30-something odd years. And so this is a redo here. This is the largest work. It's 5 feet high, 20 feet across. The final one, and hand it over to Zoe. This is from Charlottesville. The accident, if you look in the bottom corner, that's the Times' layout the day after, which I found to be really odd. That shouldn't have been secondary. So I marked that up, and I redid the layout. And this is me installing the work at Pomona College in California. So that's the counter-narrative series, and this is the work that I'll be talking about a lot tonight. All right, that's it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's
Yeah, no
awesome.
problem. No.
Do you have to?
It's fair use. Yeah.
I'm just showing this video, which is a raw edit that I made at my new fake job, which is illegally teaching high school. Sure, this is a video that think tank scholars and I made. I'm teaching high school, workshop at a high school, and we made this.
Hold tight.
So that video, it's inexplicable, and I will, part of this is that I really don't quite have the language to explain this second half of life project that I'm beginning right now. And so this is kind of a listing of the things that are happening right now with this project as it's in its kind of last formative stage. And here's a shout out from our Acme in South Philadelphia, which is the Valentine's display by one of the think tank members' mom, Michelle. So please don't forget to tell her. So right now, I'm an artist who has two projects. I had a first half of life project that culminated in 2010, and I have a second half of life project that'll begin in 2020. And to begin the second half of life project, I opted to bring my full studio and install it in a public high school, and it's illegal. And the school district can never know about it. The faculty and the principal know about it, but the school district cannot. And so I am the resident conceptual artist. And so here is my studio at the high school. And at the high school, there's a think tank that was formed. So right now, the think tank is a group of people. Here's me. That's my job there. And this is what we talk about. The think tank is a group of high school students. Philadelphia high schools, like many places, have lost an enormous amount of funding. I went to public high school in Philadelphia all the way through, and they are in dire straits, to say the least. The think tank, it's a group of, think tank is also listed now. One of the students did this, so we have all of these things listed at the school, which seem impossible, which is my own studio, my private and personal studio with my own things, a think tank formed of myself, a group of young scholars who are in high school, and others who want to come in and talk about critical thinking, knowledge, conceptual art, and a kind of post-transcendental realism and post-transcendental naturalism. That seems super lofty, but that's really for real what's happening. So here it is, in a high school. It's a magnet school. It's a school that has lost a great deal of everything. There's only 2 public high schools in Philadelphia that have libraries, and it seems like in my lifetime there will probably not be libraries available for high school students again. It is not necessarily about the materials, but the staff. There will never be someone to be able to staff the space in order for it to be used as a library, and that's just a given at this point. So I teach a workshop there that's a lot about symbiotic learning, and then I also work there for working on my own work. The scholars often say things that I have no idea about. I would say that's about 90% of the time. So one of the things that came out of the think tank, so I showed up in high school and I spent a year there talking and figuring it out, and we did different projects, and it was really who came into the room, what students literally kind of, they moved around a barrier to ask what is here. And those are the students who all form the think tank, all students who are like, what's going on in this room? And what came out of the first part of that year is that we will build a reading room, since we will never have a library again. A reading room is very different than a library. It does not require staff. All of the students have worked on not just cataloging, but learning the Dewey Decimal System and then actually shifting it for a specific collection that will reflect not only their interests, but the interests of students after they graduate. And it will be something that can be taught to students from, say, seniors to sophomores, so that it can actually be ongoing and the room can be accessed. The library can be accessed, unlike the other rooms, which are often literally padlocked. This logo came from Sam Shippen, one of the think tank members' photographs, and it became this. And this is it so far. We have there's a budget. I'm paid $0, and also the think tank has a budget of $0. So that's really what's going on. So we have we have a list of books to be donated that we request, and we hope that when people donate books that we haven't asked for, they are not terrible. And that's pretty much it. There's an endless sorting. Gabby is actually the head right now of archives and cataloging. Kyla is the head of the feminist department, as she has decided to name it.
Martha Rosler. Hannah Hawk.
John Hartfield.
So they all did an assignment about this talk that I'm giving right now. So in the talk, although you could barely hear it, is Martha Rosler, Hannah Hawk, and John Hartfeld. So they all did very small pieces on them, and then we'll be finishing it after I give the talk, and then I'll be sending it back to you guys at the Jewish Museum. I don't know why I'm just sending it back to the, yeah, I'm sending it right to Alex. Here's part of the reason why it's so very complex, and there's not really an easy way to describe the work. The work is, it's a conceptual work. It's also very difficult because much of what happens, including discussions, is actually part of the work, is part of the piece, and is the way that I would describe the artwork in its entirety. And that makes it very, very difficult to discuss something that involves a number of other people, actual physical things, and also a project that I intend to work on until I die. So that will be from now until death. This is Sam Shippen, who has been in the think tank now 2 years, who is awesome. And I had a show just a couple of months ago at Miceland Projects, which was fantastic. And then tomorrow I will pick the photos up and take them back to the high school, and they will be installed in the high school. Sam Shippen will be the one curating it, and we've been talking about it for a solid 5 months. This is the installation at Miceland Projects. It's very much about Donald Trump. The earliest photos from, it's one I made in 1987, and then one that I made 2 years ago. Sam Shippen decided that we should install it in the fallout shelter in the school and relight it with clamp lights, that it was appropriate in relation to not just fear of 80s Cold War fear related to Russia, but the idea that that would be totally appropriate for the movement in terms of subverting the way that the images are shown. This is also something that Sam Shippen and I had that we discussed, and this would never be considered part of my work, but a question that came up was about collaboration, and this is an important collaboration. So Sam Shippen and I were talking about kind of the dire straits of what it means to be a woman right in this moment, and Sam Shippen said, well, are you there, God? It's me, Margaret Atwood. That's it. It's a brand new young adult novel for what's happening with Trump. So we'll be selling these tote bags and these T-shirts based on Ms. Shippen's, I think, particularly brilliant play on words. This is Anthony, who is also a think tank member. He is someone who suggested a full list of books. Almost all of them are books that I have not read, including Das Kapital, all 3 volumes. It was ridiculous. Also, here's a picture of my mom and Anthony that I just want to point out since he lives around the corner. This is how the think tank has worked. It's back and forth, and it's very difficult. It's kind of like a piece of mercury. So here are different ways in which we kind of try and figure out how will we construct all of these things, and how am I going to be able to function in a high school as an artist? That's crazy. But it's working. So this is just an example of something that happened this week. My wife's husband's mother mailed me these rocks. They're from Rachel Carson's Salt Pond. And so they came in the mail at the school, and now the rocks are on display with the Rachel Carson books that were suggested by Anthony, who was in that picture. And then someone else will be writing something about that, which is directly related to a body of work of mine that's commencement about Louisiana and kind of the submersion of the southern parishes. And so again, that's how it works. Again, here's Ms. Shippen. We had a long discussion about whether how to describe a photograph. This was the actual succinct way that came up after our discussion. It was truly a discussion that came up with this phrasing. And then she managed to say, I can't believe that both of your works are about our institutional critique, which, first of all, I will be totally honest, I didn't know. And I looked it up, and I was like, oh, like Michael Asher. And then I went back to Sam and was like, well, did you mean institutional critique in terms? And she was like, well, yeah, you're doing it. It's not just in the it's not just about museums. I mean, here you are working kind of in the belly, literally in the belly of the beast in a public school. There you go. Thanks, Sam Shippen, because I honestly would have never described it as that, but I think it's appropriate. Also, the think tank department, because things are so desperate in Philadelphia's public schools, we will be setting up a utopian reconnaissance department in order to be able to have a space where we are comfortable. And it doesn't need to be big, but a space where you can actually take a book and read it. And that's the whole thing. Not a full structure, truly one room that might make a difference. Often I miss something. I'm grateful to the think tank student who wrote this about Stanley. I proposed all of the questions that you guys sent to the museum sent me questions. I posed them all to the think tank students. Some had relatively lucid answers. For the most part, they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then Allure just erased several answers and wrote, Allure was here at the bottom of that. And I have to say, actually, that's a pretty good answer. And I have to say, I'm playing off both meanings of Allure as a person and the word allure. So that's pretty much what's happening. It's a means of, I don't really know. It's a combination of all of these things without an easy to describe idea about institutional critique, about critical realism and the possibility of post-critical realism related to art and related to an exploration of belonging to and subverting institutional structures. So I'm hoping that makes enough sense.
Well, to start, thank you for your presentations. There's a lot to grapple with here. And I'll pose a question to each of you. First, Alex, I came across your work for the first time in the subway station. Mm-hmm. So I was waiting for the
And I have the subway photo in there, yeah.
At Clinton, Washington. And it was really impactful. People were gathering around, looking at it. Some people put graffiti on it. It was really curious, and I had no idea what it was. Yeah. But I did notice them popping up around the city. And I think there's something really interesting there about intervening into public space by determining a lack or something that needs to be done or something that needs to be visualized. So I think that guerrilla aspect is really interesting, and I think you both have that in common. Mm-hmm. I would love to know more about how you really felt, how you took it from editing and looking at these newspapers and finding these different biases that you know hit on the target, and then what took you to put them in space. And then Zoe, this new project is really compelling, and it's interesting to think about that in relation to your older or your last project, which you didn't mention, and which you have put works into. You've put images. It's okay. No, but you put images on billboards. You did a project where you were basically organizing exhibitions under a highway. So it may not. I'm interested in that jump for you, how you went from that kind of work into the school and this really direct social engagement. I can see that there's some connection, people are gathering under a highway to look at these images, and then suddenly you're then intervening into a public school. Maybe Alex, do you want to go first?
Well, the work that I'm doing, it was always meant to be shared publicly. I think the decision for me was how that was going to happen. And so when I originally started working on A Teenager with Promise, which is the one with Michael Brown, the thinking was that I would reprint the newspaper. And that I felt like would be really confusing if I reprinted the newspaper and then distributed something from 2014 in 2016. So that was I kind of X'd that idea very soon. Someone did ask about me using the Times And so there was also some nervousness about being sued. So I was also trying to figure out how to navigate that. And most of those decisions were in me changing other things, like the font, or like me relaying out the paper. I felt like maybe I was circumventing some kind of legal issue by doing that. Which later I found out and I knew to some degree, there are tons of, there's tons of artwork around the New York Times, and so I was fine. I've talked to them too, and they seem okay with it for the most part. I'm still alive after visiting their headquarters a couple of times, so I think everything is cool. But I was really kind of interested in this idea, partly my friends and I were spending a lot of time, and it was kind of an unfortunate tradition of meeting up after all these police shootings and talking a lot about that and what it meant. And we were all coming in with these various different sources. Some of us had read all these different articles, and other people had kind of social media posts. And so we were really grappling with how we felt about things based on language and our own politics, really. And so I really kind of wanted to recreate that kind of environment for other people, and maybe people who didn't know one another. And so the thinking was that I could share these works in public spaces. And I think, other things dictated that. I kind of knew where I might not get caught by the police. And so I posted in many ways based off of that. I tried the city a couple of times, and Manhattan, I think, gets cleaned a little bit more than some other areas. And so those were gone in a day, which was expensive. Some of the ones that I put at Clinton Hill were gone in a day actually as well, but on other stations they stayed up. At night when we went to certain areas, they were up. And so I think the coolest thing about that decision was that it's illegal, and so I was anonymous as the person doing it. So I got to watch from background for a little bit before my cover was blown. And so I got to see some of the conversations that were happening around that. And to my surprise, media outlets have been the most receptive, right? Because I think that they're also grappling with these blind spots. And so I think it's this kind of interesting way to intervene. But that, to me, is necessary in a public space, as opposed to me maybe passing out the newspaper again, which I think would be completely confusing. So that's what went into that decision.
I have like a million questions for you, and I'm going to try and keep them all in, but I'm just going to go with, I'm very interested in the difference in size and the way that were applied. You don't have to answer it right. Yeah. You can if you want, but
I can jump on. I can answer that right now, actually.
I'm so interested.
So the one that you saw on the wall, the smaller one, and even the larger one, those are printed actually on just plain old printing paper, like a 20-pound paper, the paper you probably print on every day, and they're put up with wheat paste, which is kind of Jenny Holzer, old school kind of, which is practically pancake mix, which I think is disgusting.
Yeah.
Can you put some pancake mix with some water and some sugar, and there you go. You got some glue. So think about your intestines. So that was that. The ones that are in the subway that aren't shown here are printed on adhesive. Just did not have time to go downstairs with a rolling pin, like a, paintbrush. So we put those on with sticky paper. Which is supposed to be permanent, but we kind of knew it was going to come down. It's just not easy to pull down. There are no police officers in here, right? Okay. And so that's how we put those up. The ones that are larger are quite often, and this is just like a brag, maybe a humble brag. The ones that are larger are actually printed on strips that are 24 inches wide, and then I just glue them really closely together so they look like one work.
Okay,
all right, that's one of your questions.
Yeah, no, that really, and I'm gonna the ones that were sticky paper laminated or laminated on the front, like matte or glossy, or just paper. I'm sorry.
Were they matte or glossy? I'm pretty sure I'm a matte girl, so I'm pretty sure there wasn't a sheen to it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's it's just that's the semantics of that are really genuinely.
That's really important to me. Yeah.
Too. Yeah. Okay, I know there was something that you asked me, but
just the transition between your last project and public space, and how you've moved from the public spaces outside, under a highway, on billboards, on the street, into the space of public school. how that connects for you.
That, thank you for asking. The last project, the project that I had, my first half of life project was I-95, and so for 10 years I showed photographs underneath an underpass in South Philadelphia the first weekend in May. And that first half of life project was one that I had a show that came after it, including the Billboard project, and that was really those were all details and kind of secondary to the completion of the installation that was in 2010. And that particular work was very much about institutional structure, access, and any number of things that also are part of the second half of life project that'll culminate in a series of 10 books. The distinct difference is that the second half of life project will culminate in books that are, I'm interested in being able to kind of be, I'm blanking on another word other than disseminate, which is so gross to me. But I'm going to say to broadcast about. So actually in the two projects, while kind of taking a look at the forms, they don't seem particularly similar, but in fact they are actually very closely allied in terms of thinking about institutional structures and honestly about institutional critique that's much larger than the idea of critiquing the gatekeepers, the ideas of institutional culture, money, in relation to the way that we believe that art is found to be worth something. And so they're both connected to kind of larger ideas in some ways that take up the scope of kind of a sprawling epic of our lives. The first one was very much about our everyday lives, and the second is very much about kind of this epic change that's about the Anthropocene, about the idea of us kind of living through a time period in which there's truly such fast progression related to climate change and related to our own anxiety and related to personally my own mortality and the idea of legacy and the idea of what it means to be alive during this really remarkable time and phenomenally tense time and difficult time. Trump, just going to put that word out there. Like I feel like it's an everyday moment, and that really impacts.
Well, it makes me think that you both are intervening into spaces of education and information and knowledge production, and that's seems central to the drive of both of your work, actually, how to enter into that space and reveal something that in institutions that are frankly suffering. The public education system, and then the news media. So these are two institutions in total crisis. So it's interesting that you both enter into these realms to elucidate.
There's this really interesting way I think about my work too. I know that it's kind of outward facing and it's public, but I think the exercise actually started maybe quite selfishly, right? I'm kind of in this system where I had to read all these things and I didn't understand exactly what this feeling was. And so a lot of my work is very process oriented, and that I'm kind of working through stages of understanding. And part of what also happens when I'm kind of editing or marking something up is also I have to check what I bring to this space too, and so there's a self-editing and checking my own bias in some ways. Although I don't think that pales in comparison to institutional bias, but so that's part of the motivation. It was also really personal and kind of selfish in many ways, and I think on the other hand too, it's also acknowledgement, right? So. I'm really interested in kind of revisiting things. And so a lot of these articles are of recent memory, but the time that I worked on them, we were probably some months to a year or 2 years out. And so I talked to a class today about it. And one of the things that I think is really important sometimes, especially in spaces with students, is that I don't think we understand how many people hear the news and they're like, that's it. That's what happened. There's no variation to that. And so what's really surprising to me is that when I enter into particularly high schools and I talk to students about the work, they uncover all these opinions they have about what they're reading that they didn't really feel like it was appropriate to kind of push out there. And so I think it's an invitation in that way, which is really important. The Charlottesville one, which was the last work that I showed you, I actually did at Bennington College. And so what we did is I gave the students a layout similar to the first one that you viewed, which was blank. And I asked them to read it and to mark it up. We of course read the entire article. I'm not trying to, miseducate people. But for the purposes of public art, rarely do I show all of the pages. It's a lot. But we ultimately worked with the front page. Everyone marked up what they thought was wrong, or what they found troubling. It was a college class. It was fairly diverse, and there was an exchange. Some people really wanted to use white supremacists over white nationalists. There was arguments about language, about photos, and then they took their time and they went online and they found their own things, and everyone did their own counter narrative. And there were some people who were very attached to punishing the people who they felt like were responsible. They weren't that objective at all. And when it came time for us to talk about it, they were actually embarrassed about that approach, that they weren't able to give space between their feelings and the work. And so I think in some ways, too, it added a level of appreciation for journalists. And so, you mentioned that guy's name.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay. You said it first. I think one of the things that's really unfortunate and annoying about him, one of the many things, is that his approach to media is they're all lying and it's just bullshit, which I think is a very irresponsible way of engaging with the media. I think there are other ways and avenues to teach people to be more critical in a way that both maybe respects the form, but then also kind of provides the reader with more tools. And so I was trying to give myself those tools as well. And I felt like some of my understanding came from so much discourse with others that I thought there was a way to put that out there for other people. And so that was a motivation in the presentation. Yeah.
Again, I just have to go back to Alex to just ask this one thing, which is because it is I'm sorry, it's really, it is actually being in this high school is something that is, it's an endless series of things that I really am discovering I know nothing about. But one of the things when I went in, I was certain it would be media literacy would be the thing that would be most needed. And just in the way you're talking about, the crisis in journalism, it does feel, and again, to talk about Trump's ways, is that it feels actually very dangerous. It's not solely just that it's irritating, but I feel like there's a great danger kind of lurking with the rhetoric. And so I'm just very interested in that work, especially related to seeing kind of the way that, I get the New York Times and I read it, I'm often critical of it, but the truth is that sometimes I'm tired and I really do not fully absorb what's being said. Again, Alex's piece about is it Ryan Lochte? Is that swimmer, a white swimmer in Brazil, and that particular image was one that I didn't see, and I read many articles about that, and I did not critically read that particular layout, and so I'm very appreciative of that, and also it's something that I have been thinking about a great deal. I've thought about it a great deal with my last work, which was very much about text, and also an interest in American press, particularly, and Americana, and also in the power of words. So. I really don't know if that answers anything, but that kind of, I just wanted to say, thanks. It's just things seem very painful, and they seem particularly difficult to get your mind around right now in terms of what's happening in the United States. And I just personally, a lot of the time I'm thinking, I can't believe this. And that is often the thing. Like people who were biased to say, I want to be able to say white supremacist, it's been very difficult to dial back my immediate feelings of genuine fear, anger, and prejudice. And those things I think are all valid, but honestly, in this moment, thinking about working on a project has significantly changed. And so I feel like these two ways of intervening or producing work or just having discourse, to me, the thing that I'm doing makes a lot of sense, even though it's very difficult to articulate. And yours also feels important and engaging to see an image in which Michael Brown is not obscured. I mean, that there's a very deep feeling in it, and it's it feels very connected to the many of the things that I'm talking about and working on in this very difficult to describe kind of chaotic environment with teenagers. Again, I know that was just totally not answered.
It's fine.
No, but
In
there's
discussion, yeah.
But it's interesting that this urgency is pushing you, each of you, to create a particular type of work, and that they're also ongoing projects. I think that's a really interesting aspect of what both of you are doing, is that it's not like you do one thing and that's it. It's an ongoing investigation that evolves over time. And just to bring it back to Martha Rosler, it's interesting because many of her projects that are similarly engaged at looking, examining, questioning are done over time. They're not finished in one day or 1 week or 1 year even. Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of what both of you are doing, is taking that time to I mean, Alex, you said it really well, critique yourself actually through what you're processing and facing and putting out in the public sphere.
Yeah. I mean, Rosler's work, House Beautiful is a series of hers that I'm most familiar with, is important to me because I think it shows the impact of a small intervention, right? There doesn't have to be this really lofty thing for you to kind of make an impact. Is this working? Okay. You can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Yeah, I feel like we have to put our mouths like on the mic. Yeah, my lips are rubbing it at this moment, so that's a lot for me. I think that Martha Rosler's work is important in the sense that at least House Beautiful for me, is that it's a small intervention. And I saw her work in Los Angeles as part of like a news media series. And I think one of the things that I feel is you can easily do as an artist is any little change or shift in something sometimes can make people think about it and have a different perspective about it. And so her, putting those images from the Vietnam War inside of these really kind of meticulous American household images is a particular type of intervention that I think is critical for how we think about kind of a sense of home and space. And so that's been a motivator for me. And that it didn't, as somebody also who didn't have a traditional kind of arts background, the kind of impact you can maybe make conceptually, these really kind of small set of skills, which are, not to say she doesn't have skills, but it just made me feel like there was space for me to do something similar and express myself in another way. And so that was really important to me.
Yeah, I actually have to say also House Beautiful and Body Beautiful. I'm sorry about that. Earlier tonight I was trying to remember where I had first seen Martha Rosler's work, and I really don't know. My mom is here, and she said that there was something about her work that reminded, that made her think of me. And I've known her work since I was a teen. I have no idea where I possibly saw it, but it's had great impact on my life, both Body Beautiful and House Beautiful. And then later, in my later teens and early 20s, then Semiotics of the Kitchen. I'm a feminist and always had an interest in feminist work, but I found it to be really fascinating that this work has resonated for 35 years at least. And it's very familiar to me and very important in the idea of both collage and montage. They're very impactful. And I also thought we swung down to just see one little part of the show. The idea that series is not done about the idea of domesticity and war. The idea that you would come back to talk about the Gulf War and the fact that we did not see those images, and we did not really see the way that you could have the Cheney-Bush-Rumsfeld structure set up, and the difference in the way that we consumed media, and the difference also in the way that we produced these collages and these montages. So the concept that this was a body of work that really, for me personally, deeply impacted me, and then it was actually not complete, because very much many of the things, talking about journalism and talking about art and talking about feminism, I spoke with someone in the audience that it feels very important for us to kind of revisit some of the things that we had accepted as done. And that's really very painful, but it was particularly seeing that aspect of Rosler's work downstairs was, I thought, very moving, and it was also a way. There's something that's very encouraging about keep going, and that felt a little bit like, all right.
I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. I see some hands jumping up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is a little bit minor compared to some of the issues we're dealing with. I was wondering about the issue of graffiti. Mm-hmm. And I remember in the heyday of the late 60s into the early 70s, my parents, Jean and Ernie, would argue about graffiti. And my father would say, oh, the graffiti all over the New England Thruway is terrific. And my mother would say, no, it's the vandals. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Your mom would say it's the vandals? Vandalism. I mean... Well, you're not going to get me to say my work's vandalism up here. Well, I mean, I think it is. You're kind of hijacking a space. I think, vandalism to me seems maybe a little more permanent than my work. I think it also, there's something about that word to me that also feels thoughtless. And so in that sense, I think it's probably not a word that I would use to describe my work. I think it's yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I probably feel both ways depending on what it is, There were some times, when I went out, where I would see, it's an intervention, but I also think that she would be hard pressed to find some graffiti artists that do things and write things that we don't understand would probably not think of themselves really as vandalizing. What's really interesting about my work, and the one that you saw where I put it on top of graffiti, that's like a street art 101 don't do, right? Uh-huh. And I did that, and someone wrote me on Instagram to say, you covered up my work.
Oh my God, what?
And I was like, look, man, I'm new. And then, I also, because I was also tired of kind of going out on my own, I said, maybe you can come out and post up with me, and I won't, so I make sure I don't cover anything up. And so in between us kind of waiting for the police to leave and us to find good places, he was talking to me about all these tags, which is what they refer to them as, tags. I know this guy, he's from Philly, he's been writing this tag, and I'm looking and I'm seeing the letter A. It's it's not a language that I really understand. So my work I see as, sometimes people refer to my work as graffiti, which I think is an odd label. But it is. It's just an intervention. Yeah.
I have another question for you, but I was interested in you going into the New York Times. Sounds kind of cocky that they would actually be like inviting you in, because you're obviously critiquing their institution, but Yeah,
we
if
didn't
you could-
listen. I think that's the cocky part.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk about that, because they're looked at as pretty liberal, so to be
Yeah.
holding them accountable.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a gap between liberal and radical, though, right? I guess maybe they could still hold that liberal tag. I got a note from someone I think was an intern at first, and then I got another note from someone on staff. I went by and I kind of sent my friends a note to tell them where I was, to let them know to reach out if I hadn't heard from me in another hour. So I didn't know if this was like real beef or, they really wanted to hear what I had to say, And it was an interesting meeting. I spoke to some editors and some writers, and I just presented really the works that I had at the time. And we talked a bit about, because the work isn't, I'm not attacking any writers. A lot of times I actually don't have a problem even with the articles. The framework, I think you can guide people to look and read things a particular way. You can determine importance by where you put the photo. You can say a lot about the subjects by aligning the images. So like each work has a lesson, right? And so it's pretty much the conversation that I had with them too. Each work has something behind it that you can use and you can kind of apply it at any point. The first work asks you to think about false equivalency. Right? The second works asks you to kind of ask about image. Is this even the right damn image, The third work is about kind of nationality and otherness, and thinking a lot about how we, name and determine who belongs and who doesn't. The fourth work is about size placement and how something, if that can communicate how important something is, right? And so I think you can apply that to the paper at any point with whatever you're looking at. You can ask yourself, why this photo? You can ask yourself, why are these subjects treated this way? Are they similar, right? Because we both know the same does not mean equal. And so that experience, I think by the time it happened, and they wrote an article about me, which was weird. They didn't really write about the work. I think it felt frustrating in a sense that I kind of knew this was because everybody else had talked about it. And so part of me felt like it was this thing that they had to do at this point, right? The New Yorker had talked about it. Village Voice had talked about, like everyone had talked about it already. And so it was kind of, everyone was waiting for them to at least kind of get it over with. And in some ways, that's what it felt like they were doing. I've been invited back. I'm kind of at the point now where I'm like, can I have some money? I have loans. I have student loans. So yeah, that was that experience. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose, right? Yeah.
Hi. I really appreciated both presentations. I was thinking about when I went to high school and I had a quiz every morning on the New York Times editorial at 8:30. So I was forced to read before going to class. And on the Metro North, it became just a habit of collecting all the foreign papers that I could find. Will you be expanding this project to other languages?
No, I mean, I think what's central for me is, I think I read the New York Times, and I feel like I'm not searching for errors. I don't like that idea. To take from Trump, it's not a witch hunt. The goal of it is to really kind of say, read what you read it with a close eye, appreciate what you read, question it. And so, I applied this. Someone from Seattle sent me some Seattle papers, and I was working on something for that, and it felt really odd to me. There was one, no reason I would be reading that paper. Two, I felt like I was looking for things to be wrong, and that didn't feel really fair to anybody who was writing it, so...
And if I may, are the students instructed in, for example, in the theory of praxis, Gramsci, hegemony? Because there are plenty of ways to instruct the students using edX, Coursera, and libraries do exist, the big libraries, and it really does change a student's life when at the age of 13, 14, they go to the big library, the New York Public Library. Because you mentioned before the Cheney-Bush structure, they all started out as Trotskyists, and so they all studied the same thing that that you are teaching, actually, with montage technique and everything else. So there are plenty of opportunities online, and there are plenty of libraries out there that can assist you in how can I say this? Making the dialogue or the project slightly more sophisticated from a critical point of view. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, for this particular project, it's very specific about the idea that there are not libraries within the public schools, which is really a tragedy. Yeah. And Philadelphia public schools, like in many other cities, also are suffering tremendously, shutting, closing doors. And there's also, while the Philadelphia Public Library is also simultaneously, like many libraries and many archivists and archives are working right now. I think you mentioned that there is a moment we feel, and I'm just using that as a generalized statement, that many people feel desperate in terms of what's happening right now, and suddenly seeing that there's a tremendous loss that we won't get back anytime soon. Yeah. So it would be, for me, it would be fantastic to be able to broaden this project and be able to have other cultural institutions, including the libraries. But the issue related to this is that I'm just one lady, and I'm in a high school that is, for the most part, has been gutted of, it doesn't have books, not a library. It has primarily teachers that teach out of field. Everyone is also working phenomenally hard in a way, and there's also been a tremendous loss, rollback of many of the strides that teachers' unions have made. They've been stripped, and there's very few supplies. So it's very, while it would be fantastic to be able to do that, it would be a project that would be that would need money. That would be one thing, which no one has, myself included, and it would need time and effort from other people. And in this context, everyone is really kind of just working to keep things moving so that they truly don't completely fall apart. So that, I mean, those things are also great, and I also look forward to the time in which that I will be able to, hopefully, to say to you, can we pay you to come down to talk? Because that would be great. But right now, sometimes it will take months and months for us to be able to figure out. We requested the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer to send us papers to a high school, which neither has done. And that's a very important part of the work. It's an important part of our work, but also a very important part of thinking about media. How do we access it? The idea of actually reading print versus online, and truly about meritocracy. The idea of what does it mean when someone says you can achieve anything except that you don't have books, nor do you actually have access to quality journalism. And it's so much more difficult than I would have anticipated, and phenomenally time-consuming. And so I also read the New York Times, but can't afford the print one. And as kind of as an add-on to to what would be the joy of a kind of a Red Channel's Trotskyist move that would kind of just bring out a moment in which we would be able to have either free schools or kind of a resurgence in which we would have people in field coming to help teach people who are younger, and that would also include people who wanted to come to learn, say, after school. And we would have civic institutions that maybe weren't perfect, but were open. So that's, I am very appreciative for that. It's, I wish that was true. I'm hoping that in the very particular small place that I have it, there will be a small way to carve a little bit of that out. Yeah.
So I would like to ask a question that really hasn't been addressed as much about the exhibition and your work, which I've so enjoyed. But I found myself in stepping into her newer space where she has the quotes from Hannah Arendt, who not so much, I'm now inspired to read the Totalitarianism, certainly On Revolution in my college days was and remains one of my bedside books when I really need clarity, I go there. And I'm just wondering, it was such a different presentation. It's almost like a, in this phase, somewhat sacred text. I'm just wondering, did you have any time, you may not have, but any time or feel an inspiration? And if so, and this is actually for all three of you, perhaps, what author and where would you go? I mean, this is a really different way for her to present her consideration, where she's presenting the text as image. And it's quite lovely.
I love that. I mean, I'm just a fan of text-based work, so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, not to insult people, but I think a lot of people don't like to read, so that's one thing. And I think if we can kind of trick them into doing it through art, that's a good thing. This actually is my first encounter with that piece, I think, that you're talking about, that's downstairs. And yours as well, yeah. So it was a departure for me. I'm used to kind of image-focused work of hers. And she and I were, we're part, it's kind of work, right? We're looking at it and we're like, this is a great presentation. I should take photos. What is that material? So that's kind of the conversation we had when we were looking at it. I'm working on a new series called No Humans Involved. After Sylvia Winter, it's looking at the daily news coverage of the Central Park 5 case. And that's a very text. I actually removed the images from most of that work. And it's done through printmaking. And part of what my engagement with that is a variety of ways to illuminate particular words and phrases, right? And so I was really interested in the presentation of that work. That's the impact it had on me. I haven't spent too much time with it just yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that work is actually very interesting in that it's spatialized too. I think that's actually what, to me, marked the biggest shift, is that the viewer's body in relation to these texts, and that it's transparent, and that you can be immersed in it in some way, or lose yourself in it, or be found in it. And I thought that was a very powerful message. And because Rosler has worked so much about domestic spaces, that she creates a sort of architecture through this text for the viewer.
Because it kind of like blinds almost, right? Just pull down. Yeah.
But, actually, this was, I'm very interested in that work in relation to the Bowery work. And I'm very interested in both the idea of concept of transparency, the transparency of that, the idea of Bowery work, which is including kind of a categorical list of what would be happening in terms of portraiture next to the other image. And then the idea that there's a sort of transparency within that particular construction. So I'm very interested in it. And I'm super interested in spending a little time to kind of think about it, particularly in relation to past work, because I feel like there's a very strong connection. I also really love text-based work. I find it to be really very engaging for myself, and I really am very interested because there's also the idea that you are reading kind of behind it, and you are also there's the idea that there's a kind of palindrome that's happening. And so in terms of exhibition display and actual printing of the Bowery work, along with this work that I'm very interested in terms of presentation and concept of kind of text floating in space, especially with the idea of a distinct shift in the way that we absorb text, especially journalism, the idea that we receive it screen-based now, not just necessarily printed. It seems it's of great interest to me. I'm super into it. But I really don't have more than that kind of initial reaction of genuine excitement to look at it again.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one last question. I see one more hand. Oh, two. Okay.
I really appreciate your wonderful presentations and becoming familiar with your work. It's very, very powerful, and I really support what you're doing. And I've been sitting here the whole time looking at this image behind you and feeling more and more unsettled all the time, further that you were going into talking about your work, because of this idea of pulling the curtain back, like the America's supposed to be the leader of the free world and we're standing up for human rights, but then when you really pull the curtain back, you see all this carnage, and it's not just in Vietnam, it's happening on the streets of our own cities. And so I really think you're doing important work by putting a lot of emphasis on that this is problematic. This is we have to deal with what we say we are and what we really are doing, so we can start to resolve some of these issues. And I really think the work you're doing is very powerful in that sense. That certain schools get books and others don't, and certain teachers get paid more than others, and why that's happening. So it's really important what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. That was and good night, because that was an amazing statement about that we're great. Thank you.
What we have today with fake news, if you look back to the Nixon administration, it was, the pejorative was media, which is now acceptable. And it was a way to diminish the press, and it created consonance with entertainment. And so this has been happening for a long time.
Centuries.
So and it's incremental. In Hitler's Germany, there were more magazines and newspapers than in any other European country at the time. And in 6 months, Hitler controlled all of them. So this is fake news is yet another layer of this diminishment of the credibility of the press. I still call it press. I came out of a journalism background.
I roll with that. I roll with that too. I mean, I get asked a lot about fake news, right? And so when I do a presentation, I usually go through a series of slides in chronological order that talk about kind of where kind of mainstream media was, or the press was, in the 1800s up until now. One of the first slides that I share is a classified ad for the sale of 400 slaves. And so, I think we think of fake news as someone's talked about pedophiles working at a pizza place. But I ask people to kind of think, would you consider it fake news if majority of the population, they weren't even considered citizens or humans? And so, a number of American papers, the only way you could find or figure that black people exist is where they were being sold. They weren't being interviewed, right? Their entire perspectives missing. So that's not real to me either. And so fake news is old. It's an old occurrence. I think we should think about that. The modern media, as we know, is quite subtly just 60 years ago. I think Atlanta papers, some Louisiana papers, they actually had editors to ensure that there were no images of black people. Like somebody's job was to make sure there were no actual visuals of blacks in the paper. So you have what's been interesting now, and I don't know if why papers seem to be more on the defensive. You have papers issuing apologies about how they wrote about slavery. And how they wrote about lynchings. I think Alabama maybe paper editorial where they apologized for some of the ways they depicted lynchings. At the time, a lot of papers they were celebrations, and these were kind of uncritical. So I think fake news is very old. So when I get asked about it now, it just feels. I'm sorry. Remember the name. So yeah, I think it's important to, like you said, to really think about these other examples, both internationally and here.
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to break in too. Yellow journalism is something that it's ongoing. But honestly, the idea that we would have a press that would understand there was a past and to apologize for the way that they had actually depicted lynching or slavery, to me seems as if that is a healthy progression in the way that journalism would move to think about the roles that journalism has in forming not just our opinions, but disseminating news. But on the tail end of that is that you mentioned Germany, and truthfully, I think one of the most important aspects of not just your work right now, but thinking about journalism is the fear of fascism, and what does that mean in terms of the way that a free press would suddenly be diminished. It's definitely being diminished right now in different ways for different economic reasons, and there's a way in which the idea of a free press is being not just attacked, but actually being dismantled in different ways. And that's, personally, I find that to be I'm very afraid of that. And I would be really very thrilled in terms of thinking, instead of the idea of thinking about fake news, but the idea of thinking about the history of the way that we have spoken about news and journalism, and being able to present news without the great fear of economic retribution. As one could think about for the Bezos post David Pecker moment right now, which is, again, sorry I brought that up.
Oh, it's okay. I think it's a good way for us to
that's
wrap up.
Yeah, just on the word Pecker.
That's the kicker, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you all for
something to think about.
thank you all for sharing your work and your reflections on the Rosler Show with us tonight.